Today we're doing 13.5, solving rational equations. Homework is page 596, 1 through 33 odd, and number 34. All right, so we've done this before. We have solved rational equations. The difference is we have choices now. Before we get started, I want you to practice. We'll go back to that. I want you to practice deriving your quadratic formula by completing the square. And that is, start by going from ax squared plus bx plus c equals 0. I'd like you to complete the square and get the quadratic formula. Pause the recording. All right, let's check our work. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to subtract c from both sides. I'm left with ax squared plus bx equals negative c. I'm then going to divide all terms by my lead coefficient, a. You'll see we'll be left with x squared plus b over a x equals negative c over a. Okay, to find that middle term, do this away from the problem. My iPad is limited in space, but you have way more space. So you do this off on the side. Remember, we're going to take the middle term, b over a. We divide it by 2 and we square it. Remember, b over a divided by 2 is really multiplying by the reciprocal. And so it becomes b over 2a, and we're squaring it, so that makes b squared over 4a squared. We have to square all parts. So I'm going to add b squared over 4a squared. I'm adding that to both sides. Okay, I'm now going to factor both sides, but I'm going to factor the left side, sorry. And on the right side, I'm going to give it a common denominator. I'm going to multiply this side by 4a over 4a, that fancy one. Use my identity property. So over here, I'm doing x. The root of x squared is x. The root of b squared, we know it's got to be a plus, is a b. The root of 4a squared is a 2a. Okay, I'm factoring that. Equals, and now I can combine this to b squared minus 4ac, and it's all over 4a squared. I can now root both sides, and I get the absolute value of x plus b over 2a equals square root of b squared minus 4ac all over the square root of 4a squared. To lose the absolute value, I'm going to set this side equal to plus or minus. The numerator is not a perfect square because of that ac, so I need my b squared minus 4ac under the radical, but the denominator, 4 is a perfect square and a squared is a perfect square, it becomes 2a. I'm now subtracting b over 2a, subtract b over 2a, and we end up with x equals negative b over 2a plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And can't we just write that as x equals negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. There we go. And you, my friends, have derived the quadratic formula by completing the square. So generally, I would be practicing this at least once a day. Generally, I give my kids a time test where they have to finish this in like 2 or 3 minutes. And if they don't pass it, they get 0 points. It's like usually a 5-point quiz. Not sure if we're going to be able to do that. All right, so let's go to our lesson. Today we're solving rational equations. We did this in chapter 7. The difference is there's going to be a point where we get choices on how to solve a quadratic. And remember, a quadratic is anything with x squared. And the choices we have are solve by graphing, which is not a favorable one. The next one is by factoring. Back in chapter 10, all you knew how to do was factor. The next one we learned was the square root method. That only works when you have like two terms. And then we learned how to solve by completing the square. And the fifth was the quadratic formula. So probably solve by graphing is the least favorite because that's where we have to find our axis of symmetry, a vertex. Factoring should be very easy for you at this point. But these two are the ones that work all the time. Factoring, not everything's factorable. If it has more than two terms, you're not going to use the square root method. So the difference now is we're still solving the same way, and when we get to that point where we have an x squared, we have choices on how we want to solve it. You still might want to factor. So remember, we're dealing with fractions, so there's some restrictions, and the restriction is the denominator is not allowed to sum or difference to 0. So what would give me a 0 is if x equaled 1. And I do know that this is kind of intuitive. If you look at the denominators are equivalent, so is the numerator. But it is an algebra class, so I want you to solve it algebraically. So you can do cross products. Remember, x times x minus 1 times the quantity of 2 times x minus 1. I don't want you to skip that step and just go right to x squared minus x. How do you get x squared minus x? You're justifying. So now we can go to x squared minus x equals 2x minus 2. I'm going to set everything equal to 0, so I'm moving my 2x over, do the opposite. I'm going to add 2 to both sides. And now we have a choice. Can we factor? We can do the quadratic formula. I'm going to do the quadratic formula really quick. A is 1, B is -3, and C is 2. So I'm doing x equals -3 plus or minus the square root of -3 squared minus 4 times 1 times 2 all over 2 times 1. So that means x equals 3 plus or minus the square root of 9 minus 8 all over 2. So it's 3 plus or minus the square root of 1 over 2. So 3 plus 1 over 2, or 3 minus 1 over 2. So that's 4 over 2, which is 2, and that's 2 over 2, which is 1. And this doesn't work, so 2 is your solution. Okay, we could have also factored. Pause it if you want to write the notes. I'm going to move on. I could have factored. So this is the point where I have choices. What multiplies to 2 and adds to -3? -2 and -1. So x minus 1 times x minus 2 equals 0. X minus 1 equals 0. X minus 2 equals 0. So x is equal to 1 and x is equal to 2. But this doesn't work. So you have multiple ways. We could have solved by completing the square. I likely wouldn't have done it because 3 would have given me a fraction. So I think I would likely be factoring because it's the fastest way for me. Let's try the next one. So next one, my restrictions are 0. And I'm going to clear my denominator by multiplying everything by x. Okay? So if I multiply, I get x squared plus 5 plus 6x equals 6x. Now I'm going to subtract and set it equal to 0. Again, this is the point. You can use a quadratic formula, you can factor. If it's easy factoring like this, I generally factor. What would multiply to 5 and add to 6? Negative 6, how about negative, I'd go 5, negative 5, and negative 1. Yep, that would work. And so my solutions would be 1 or 5, and both of those work. Okay, pause the recording if you want to take more notes. Just a little bit more of the same. So here we go. My restrictions. Remember, we have to look at all denominators. For the first denominator, right here, we can't have a 0. For right here, a 6 would give me a 0, and this would also be a 0. So it would be 0 and 6 are my restrictions. I'm going to be multiplying by, I need the binomial x minus 6, and I need an x all by itself to clear both x's, and an x minus 6 to clear the binomial. So that's what we're... Now, when I distribute, be very careful. Okay, the x's cancel, and then I'm going to be left with x minus 6. Don't say x squared minus 12, because remember, we're going to have to, oh, sorry, x minus 2. Double distribute, or FOIL. Minus x minus 3 equals 4 over x, equals 4, and then I have to distribute again. Sorry, I'm distributing on the first one. The x's cancel, so we get x minus 6 times x minus 2. The second one, the x minus 6 cancels, so we are left with minus x times x minus 3. The third one is the x's cancel, so it's 4 times x minus 6. Now, we have to FOIL that. Remember, if I add those two, it's the middle coefficients. It comes to the middle coefficient. If I multiply the last two digits, it multiplies to the last digit. And the next one I get, negative x squared plus 3x. And on the next one, I'm going to get 4x minus 24. I can combine my like terms, my x squareds, and those will cancel out. So then I'm left with negative 8x and 3x is 5x plus 12. Move all the x's over to one side. Move the 24 over to the other side. And we get x is equal to 4. And that works with our restrictions. Pause the recording if you need to take more notes. All right, next one, my restrictions. For the first denominator, it would be a negative 1. For the second denominator, it'll be a positive 1. So, and my least common denominator would be the quantity of x plus 1. That will help me clear that. And the quantity of x plus 1, that will help me clear the second fraction, the first fraction, sorry. Okay, so when I distribute, nothing cancels for the first one. When I distribute, the x plus 1 clears, and I'm left with the quantity of x minus 1, plus when I distribute, the x minus 1 cancels, and I'm left with 3 times x plus 1. Remember, this is all over 1, and that's why we get that cross-canceling here. And this cancel. Or when I distribute here, this and this cancel. Okay? I'm gonna, I would likely multiply x plus 1, x minus 1, because that's the difference of squares. And then over on the right, I'm gonna do 3x plus 3. I've now got to distribute in that negative 2x. I'm going to combine all like terms, subtract 2 from both sides, and then I would likely add 2x. I don't know why this subtracts it. But now I can still factor here. I don't think I would want to use a quadratic formula on something this easy. So I'm going to factor a negative 2x. Negative 2x equals x plus x plus 2 times x plus 2, not equals. And then I set both equal to 0, negative 2x equals 0, x plus 2 equals 0, and x equals 0, and x equals negative 2. And both of those work. All right, let's try the next one. Why don't you pause it and try this one on your own. Now let's check our work. My restrictions are 1 or 0. Okay, my least common denominator is x times x minus 1. I'm going to distribute. I get 3x. I get 8 times x minus 1. And I get 3x times x minus 1. I can distribute. I get 3x plus 8x minus 8. And then I get 3x squared minus 3x. Over here I have 11x. Combine my like terms. And now I'm going to move everything over to the right. So I'm going to subtract 11x and subtract and add 8. Now this is one I might use my quadratic formula. You can do lead coefficient factoring or quadratic formula. I'm going to use the quadratic. So I'm just going to put it over here. A equals 3, B equals negative 14, and C equals 8. So I'm doing x equals negative b plus or minus the square root minus 4ac all over 2a. So x equals negative 3, not negative, negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 3 squared minus 4 times 3 times 8 all over 2 times 3. So I get x equals negative 3 plus or minus, that would be 9 minus, oh boy, b squared. Okay, hold on, that was what I did wrong. Boy, I've been made a mistake this morning too. It's 14 squared, and this should be 14 too. My b is 14, I kept using a. And it's a negative, so it's negative 14. So, boy, let's just repeat that. So it's 14 plus or minus the square root of 196 minus 12 times 8 is 96 all over 6. So that is 14 plus the square root of 100 all over 6. 14 plus 10 over 6, or 14 minus 10 over 6. So it's 24 over 6 is 4, and this would be 4 over 6 is 2/3. Now earlier today, what I had done was, if you end up with, I substituted, I forgot the 8. I think I forgot the 8. And so I got 12.8, like the square root of 164. And so I got like about 12.8. So remember, we'd be going 14 plus 12.8 or 14 minus. But my numbers were so far off, I went back and checked. So you could have done that. You could have done your lead coefficient factoring. Remember? What multiplies to 24, so it would be x squared minus 14x plus 24, and adds to negative 14. 12 and 2, I think that would work. X, let's see what multiplies to positive 24 and adds to negative 14. How about negative 12, negative 2, x minus 2, x minus 12. We can then divide by that lead coefficient of 3. And so here I'm going to get x minus 4. Over here I'm going to get 3x minus 2 equals 0. So 3x minus 2 equals 0. I'm going to add 2. 3x equals 2. Divide by 3. And x equals 2/3. X minus 4 equals 0. I'm adding 4. X equals 4. So could have done lead coefficient. This is the point where you have choices. We could solve by completing the square, factoring, quadratic formula. Back in chapter 10, all you could do was factor. Okay, so I've shown you a couple ways. Let's look at a couple more problems. I believe there's about 8 altogether. So they're just factoring. It's different. They're just doing. All right. Pause if you want. Okay, my restrictions are -2. Before I can do that, I have to factor the denominator. Okay, so in that denominator, that second denominator, I have an x all by itself. So that would give me a 0. Set everything equal to 0. So x cannot equal -2 and x cannot equal 0. And then when I clear, I'm going to multiply by x times x plus 2. Here I'm going to end up with a 2x. Here I end up with minus x. And here we end up with x times x plus 2. I'm going to distribute and set it all equal to 0. This is nice, easy factoring GCF. Take out an x, x plus 1. My solutions are 0 and -1. 0 doesn't work, so -1 is the only answer. Okay? Pause the recording if you want to write those notes. Next one. I am on, yep, 2 more left to do. My restrictions are +1 and 0. Okay? My least common denominator is going to be x minus 1 and an x. When I distribute to the first one, I'm left with a x times 2x plus 3. When I distribute to the second one, I'm left with the quantity of x plus the quantity of x minus 1. When I distribute to the third one, I'm left with 3 times x. And then we distribute 2x squared plus 3x plus x minus 1 equals 3x. I'm going to set everything equal to 0. Good time to do lead coefficient factoring. What multiplies to 2 and adds to 1, right? What multiplies to, I should do it right. Okay, x squared plus x minus 2. So what multiplies to -2 and adds to 1? How about +2 and -1? So it's x minus 1 times x plus 2 equals 0. X is, oh, can't go, forgot. What was I supposed to do? Remember, we have to divide by 2. I get 2x minus 1 times x plus 1 equals 0. So 2x minus 1 equals 0. Add 1, add 1. 2x equals 1 divided by 2. And x equals 1 over 2. And here, x plus 1 equals 0. So x is equal to -1. And both work because my restrictions are 1 and 0. So it's -1 and 1/2. Okay? I believe I have one more for you guys to check out. All right, remember we have to factor first. X plus 2, x minus 2 before we can figure out restrictions. So my solution, my restrictions, x can't equal -2 and x can't equal +2. My least common denominator will be x plus 2, x minus 2. When I distribute, I'm left with, for the first fraction, I'm just left with an x squared. When I distribute for the second fraction, I'm left with plus x minus 2 because these cancel out. Okay? When I distribute for the third fraction, I'm left with a 3 times x plus 2 because the x minus 2's cancel out. I'm going to distribute on the right and then set everything equal to 0. Nice and easy to factor. What multiplies to -8 and adds to 2, -4 and +2. So x is equal to 4 and x is equal to -2, but only one of those works. And that, my friends, is the lesson. Have a great day.